Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And this is the first time in 16 weeks that it's just the two of us.
That's right.
Feels very intimate.
Yeah, it's no one else is around to talk with. We've been doing this interview series, if you've been following along, with all of the 16 Myers-Briggs types. And we just concluded in the last episode with Gary, who's an INFJ. And now it's just back to me and Antonia talking to you. So there's three of us here now, me and Antonia and you listening.
So we were going to, what we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about what came up for us over the last 16 weeks, interviewing people who know type, know themselves, and are on a growth path, which is a breath of fresh air, honestly, to talk to people who hit the center of that Venn diagram, that they are looking at type or experiencing type not just as a theoretical model or not just as something to sort of understand the world better, but to understand themselves and to get through some very difficult times. You know, we had people who talked about uncoupling from their partners. We had people talking about going through major medical traumas. We had people from all sorts of walks of life and how they've used type or an understanding of personality systems to get through some of those complicated situations, some of those really rough time periods, and to understand and know themselves enough to enter a growth path. And for many of them, what they ended up learning about themselves, I mean, it set them off on a completely different trajectory from the life they had lived before. So I love that we talked to people who were so invested, not just into type, but also into their growth path. I think that's one of my favorite parts of doing this interview. And because of that, I mean, some people almost didn't sound like the usual stereotypical examples of their personality type. And that's what happens when you're on a growth path. You're not going to look like the middle of the bell curve. You're going to look like more of the edges.
Well, it illustrated to me just how many stereotypes we all have in our heads collectively in the type world, even in society and on the internet. It's like these very oversimplified views of personality, of how, and not just like the four letters, like an INFJ, for example, but also like oversimplification of how the cognitive functions are. I'm like, wow, we really all have to do a better job at expanding the nuance, the depth, the understanding, and kind of go back to the original Jungian frameworks that this all emerged from.
I understand why this happens, though, because when a person is first starting type, I talk about it in profile training. We talk about how when you first start type, it's almost like you're looking at it like a coloring book. It's really bold black lines, lots of white space. You're just trying to master what is a really complex, complicated system. And the further along you get when you learn cognitive functions and how they relate to these personality types, because each of the cognitive functions, like you can understand them individually, but in practice, they don't live in silos. Like you're never using, say, the cognitive function of introverted sensing or memory all by itself. It's always in conjunction with its polarity opposite of extroverted intuition and exploration. So that's going to color how it shows up. And then it's going to be paired with either extroverted feeling, harmony, or extroverted thinking effectiveness, depending upon if the person's an STJ or an SFJ. That's going to color it. Where it falls in the stack is going to color how introverted sensing or memory shows up. If it's a dominant driver or auxiliary co-pilot, that's going to change it. Are you talking about a person who's using it as part of their car model, but they are not an SJ? They're an NP. So now we're talking about a tertiary 10-year-old or inferior 3-year-old. I mean, all of these change the flavor of how the function shows up. So when we first try to understand this model, and I mean, that's assuming you're going down to that deeper layer, that you're not staying at the top layer of dichotomies, which is where most people stayed for decades before this type world started really getting into cognitive functions about 15 years ago.
Even type professionals often stayed at that level.
Yeah, exactly. There were people who did understand functions, and sometimes they understood them well, but they didn't think other people would understand them. Like there's pretty famous examples of, you know, the old guard type professionals who wrote books and provided a lot of resources for others that never talked about the functions or rarely did because they feared that people interested in the subject wouldn't really be able to catch on. And I think I've said this on the podcast, it's been a long time, but I know people who read the entire book, Gifts Differing by Isabel Briggs Myers. And Isabel, of course, mentions functions in Gifts Differing, but I know people who read the entire book and came away not knowing she mentioned them at all. And so there was this time period where type really didn't dive into that aspect of it, and maybe for good reason. You know, you and I have talked about how when it comes to things like spiritual practices, sometimes there is benefit in a spiritual practice being a little esoteric, being a little, sort of behind walled gardens. Because once something becomes available to the masses, now it loses some of its fidelity. It loses some of its, I don't want to say magic, but it's like the purpose of the spiritual practice to begin with.
Well, I think some things need to be earned, not like deservedly earned, but like information given to you, you're not going to value as much as if you had to seek it out. Like if you had to seek that information, you had to discover it yourself or through a process. The moment you discover it, you're like, wow, look at what I found. But if somebody just hands it to you, like, oh, okay, whatever, and you toss it over your shoulder potentially.
Or take it at face value.
Exactly.
Yeah, don't dive deeper. Don't connect it to the self. Don't understand a bigger implication or meaning. You just receive it. You just go, oh, okay, that's how that works. And that's very common for us to do, right, as we're trying to organize the world. So there was a time period where cognitive functions were a part of this overall ecosystem, but it was more of like an earned thing. You had to go seek them out. You had to go consult, sources like Jung's book Psychological Types, and then type or functions were more referenced, but like in Gifts Differing, there was reference to them, but not a lot of the kind of style of deep dive that we see today, even though that was, of course, originally the source. And then there started to be books written entirely about cognitive functions. Like, one of the earliest books I saw was Lenore Thompson's Personality Types and Owner's Manual that really dived into the functions. And there were some other references, Naomi Quink wrote about them and some other people wrote about them. But though they never caught attention in the public domain. And that's, again, maybe there was a reason for that. But then about 15 years ago, as communities, or maybe even 20 years ago, but I really got onto this thing about 15, I guess close to 20 years ago. These communities that started to build up around Myers-Briggs online when social networking and social media, different websites started to pop up over and over again. And even maybe in groups, bulletin boards, BB boards, and that kind of thing. There were these type-based communities that really started to infuse cognitive functions in them. But there was an earned component to it. You had to figure them out and really understand them. And those communities were built around trying to get deeper and deeper into it. And now I see that functions are pretty much like a known component of type, at least in the type community, which could be argued as anybody who's talking about type online. Cognitive functions are that's just something you're supposed to know. But it's still a complex situation or a complex topic. It's still a complex system, way more complex than I think that we give it credit for because now it's more public domain. I feel like we oversimplify the texture that's really represented in this entire system.
Well, and I think we should probably talk about this maybe on a future podcast because there's probably a lot to talk about on this subject. But in the midst of us doing this interview series, you and I were invited to speak at several of the Association of Psychological Type organizations around the world. And we've been giving this presentation talking about how do we bridge the old guard, what's come before, the type professionals, with this new world of type influencers online, YouTube stars and people that want to talk about type to a new growing audience through these online channels. And one of the things that we talked about was how type has become distilled down to something that's oversimplified, like you're talking about. We call it the mimification of type. At this point, a lot of times there's this meme around what a personality type means or even what the cognitive functions mean. And it's been reduced to this meme level kind of, I wouldn't say it's sarcastic, but it's kind of like this very playful, which is nice. It's very accessible, but man, the fidelity is going quick as you memify things. other things get globbed onto it. It strips out the core meaning of it. And I don't have any issue with it generally. It's just that there's way more behind the meme. There's way more to understand about these. And if we only see it at a meme level for a great YouTube video, yeah, that's going to get ad clicks and ad revenue. That serves what you're trying to do on a YouTube channel, but it certainly doesn't help people understand more about themselves or have an encounter with themselves. It's just entertainment, which is totally valid, but it's not necessarily helping anyone understand who they are.
And when you're first starting about type, I think those resources, again, they're the the coloring book level of understanding type. And I think that's valuable. You have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So bold lines, bold, thick, black lines in a coloring book give you edges to color within. And that's a great starting point to learn, again, this very complex system. As you go further down the rabbit's hole and get more and more and more texture, you have to let go of the mimification. It's okay as an entry point. Like you said, it's very accessible, but you have to let go of that and start to see that eventually, I used introverted sensing or memory and all of its relationships to the rest of the functions that it has relationships with, and where does it fall in your cognitive function or car model. And eventually you get to a point where you start to realize there's barely edges here, right? It looks more like a Monet. When you look at a Monet painting, there are no lines. There's just colors that merge with each other. And the merging of it, like all of a sudden pink stops and dark pink starts, and then purple starts, and then now it's blue. And that's effectively how cognitive functions show up in us. It's almost like it bleeds into the next function. And sometimes it's hard to see where one starts and the other stops, especially if they have such a strong relationship to each other. So the further you go down this rabbit's hole, the more texture you see, the more complicated it is, the less everything can be quantified or diagnosed by being the center of a bell curve. But I think understanding it at that level takes a lot of not just distinction making, but a lot of discretion. Like there's a discreteness about this system. And that's based on not familiarity with the model. I think when we get really obsessed with the model and we have to understand absolutely every nook and cranny of how all the different ways all of these things can show up, I think that actually doesn't really serve us in understanding the discretion. I think familiarity with people of these types, familiarity with all the different ways they can show up, I think that's it's a better teacher than just the theory and the system itself. And so I think what I loved about these interviews is that they were people who were living the experience of being these types. And we vetted them very well. Like they are people who come through our profiler training program, which is all by itself a 6-month course. And then I think almost everybody, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 people, have also been in our advanced program. And a handful of them were accredited, meaning they've gone through our Profiler Training 101 class. They've come to a 5-day live event. They have gone through 2 6-month courses back to back, and then eventually gone through an accreditation process, which is a testing process with an exam. And so everybody that's gone through it, like I said, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 people, have effectively been doing a deep dive, hands-on training They have a deep dive, hands-on relationship training with the system and using it in the practical way of profiling other people. So we're not talking about beginners. We're not talking about people at the beginning of their process or just kind of trying to figure it out. And oftentimes you'll hear, I did understand I was a different type as I went through this process. It did become clear to me as I got more and more intimately involved with the system and understood all of these more fleshed out parts. And so when you talk to people with that level of understanding and awareness of the system, and then because we tend to attract people into our ecosystem that are growth oriented already, because that's how we talk about it. We talk about type through the lens of personal growth. So the people who come to Profiler training tend to be people who are on a growth path. They're using this system in that way. And that's one of the best things I think about Profiler training is that we attract all these amazing people into the program, which is awesome. So we had a lot of really qualified people to pull from. And as they talked about being their type in their lives, and we were hearing these lived experiences. That to me is such a great way to detether the idealism or the conceptualness or the abstraction of type into what it means to be this person, and maybe not even a stereotypical version of this person or personality type.
I think the other thing this interview series helps illustrate is if you're listening along to one of the types that we interviewed and you're like, this doesn't show up how they're supposed to show up, I think that's a good thing because, there's this argument that type puts people into boxes. There's only 16 types of people out of 7.5 billion humans on the planet. And that's just ridiculous. How could you say there's only 16 types out of that many people? Well, I look at it as there's 16 archetypes of people that help us understand just how different we actually are. If we can understand that there's kind of 16 groupings and archetypes, this is kind of how people are wired in this general sense. Well, now we can see just how unique everybody is on top of that. Like once we get past that archetypical kind of organization, you're seeing all the variants of interest, family background, culture, time period of history, all the things that make you a human. That's ancillary to your type. Your personality type is your cognition. It's how you're wired to think. It doesn't mean your values and interests are going to necessarily match every other person that is of that same type. And so I love typology because it doesn't put people in boxes. It helps us frame out just how much uniqueness there actually is in the world.
Yeah, well, 16 archetypes through this lens specifically.
Yeah.
There's like lots of, I can be a different archetype from different points of view, right? Like I have ENTP preferences, which makes me have a certain archetypal energy from the lens of that system. But I also, we went through the goddess and god archetypal system, and I'm an Aphrodite archetype. Well, in Jean Shinoda Boleyn's books, the goddesses, goddesses in every woman and gods in every man, according to her chart in the back, and she's a Jungian analyst, the Aphrodite archetype is supposed to have sensation and feeling preferences. And so even though I identify as an Aphrodite archetype, because she's not looking at it through the lens of type, she's not looking at it through the lens of Myers-Briggs or how we have now used Carl Jung's functions to understand personality types in the Myers-Briggs system. I don't think she's even, that's not her bag at all. She's just looking at it like, what would Aphrodite be? Oh, she'd be more of a sensual person. She'd be more of a feeling person. But I have ENTP preferences and still identify as an Aphrodite. So I'm occupying two different archetypes simultaneously, and I feel like a whole person, but I'm occupying these two different archetypes and these two different ways of looking at archetypal energies. And that's just two systems, right? And now add on and layer on all these different systems. And now you're not just occupying a single archetype, you're occupying a lot of different archetypes. And so that's one of the reasons why diagnosing our personality type doesn't put us in a box, because it doesn't say it's the whole picture. It's not a complete story. It's just an understanding of who we are through the lens of this narrative, like this system.
This is why typing is challenging, because from a distance, Antonia, on camera, you might have a more sensor feeling nature to you, but your cognition is clearly NT, right? But other people look at that and go, wow, maybe she's a sensor feeler. Maybe she doesn't know her personality very well, because these other NTPs, these ENTPs that I see, maybe they've got a different goddess archetype. A female ENTP has a Athena archetype. She's very maybe business focused. Well, that's more like an NT right there.
Well, and most ENTPs are masculine, right?
Yeah.
They have more, in the gods in every man, they have more of a Hermes archetype. Most ENTPs do, or some other archetypal energy. And so just the fact that I'm a woman who has feminine preferences means that I'm going to look different than other ENTPs. Although I think most people who listen to the podcast don't end up thinking that I have sensor feeler preferences. But that said, I am going to show up in different ways, using different archetypal energies. And that is the same for anybody who's being interviewed. And, that's the same for anybody who's going to be in a different style platform, is they're going to show a different part of themselves to the world, their persona, basically. They're going to show a different slice of who they are depending upon the platform, because that's how they feel comfortable showing up in that context.
Yeah, and this is probably a good time to mention too that the platform, the medium itself matters. Like how the message is presented can alter how you perceive it to be. So, for example, there's been some profiler training students who have said, man, how does Antonia do a live profiling session on stage? She's so elegant. She's so amazing. She's got all this dialed in. And I'm like, you got to remember, if you're comparing yourself to a very highly synthetic presentation, I mean, there's an entertainment value to you doing a profiling session on stage, Antonia. And we've edited the video a little bit because for time and for presentation, you're not seeing all of it. You're not seeing all the nuance, and sitting back and watching that and judging yourself that you're not as good as that is crazy. And I tell profiler training students, don't measure yourself based on that. I would also say, if you're listening along an interview series like this and you're like, this person doesn't sound like an introvert, they're answering too quickly. Well, you don't realize all the moments that I've edited out, them pausing and taking like a minute to come up with the answer that we just asked them, the question we just asked them. And we're presenting this in a way that's palatable for the listener to really understand the information. So you're missing a lot of the in-between spaces, right? You're missing the parts that we had to remove just for the presentation. So the medium does alter some of how you see it. So you have to kind of trust the people presenting have already done the vetting for you by the time you listen to something like that.
Yeah, there's a entertainment value that goes into everything that's presented for a mass audience.
That's right.
And so there's going to be editing that ensures that there's a more entertainment value, or at least not something that would throw people out. You know, you hear too many word whiskers, you can't hear the content anymore because all you can pay attention to is the word whiskers. Or
long pauses. You're like, did the audio go dead? What happened?
Yeah. And so as people who create that content, we have to make sure that we're editing out those word whiskers so the person doesn't just hear the word whisker, or editing out the long pause spaces so that you don't think that your phone died as you were listening to the podcast.
Right.
Right, exactly. And so there's a little bit of what they used to call like movie magic element of it.
Yeah.
And so that has to be accounted for as well. But to go back to this previous idea of hearing a lot of different flavors of type, the challenge here is that you don't want to completely remove all the guardrails, in the sense that a single personality type can show up as a lot of different flavors, but it can't show up as every flavor, meaning that you're not going to be able to be any type if you don't have certain markers and traits that are assigned to that type. So that's what makes it difficult. You have people who are at the center of the bell curve of their type. You have people who are on the edges of the bell curve of their type. And then you have people who are mistyped. And the people who are mistyped love people like us saying that, because we give people who are mistyped permission to be a personality type that they want to be or that they're identified with now, without having some of the core nucleus markers of this type. So I also want to make it so that it's not like, well, you can be any type you want to be. I mean, you're allowed to. You can claim whatever you want to as your best fit type. And most of the time, I'm not going to say anything about it because it's not really my job to interrupt. Well, if somebody comes and get professionally profiled, it is my job. But as far as just interacting and engaging with somebody, there are a lot of times when somebody will say, these are my type preferences. And my mind will go, maybe that might be it. But it's also another person's prerogative to go through their own growth journey. And hopefully that growth journey will lead somebody to their true best fit type, as in they're not just identifying with certain components of a type description, or they're not identifying with something that they wish they were, that they settle into, that truly tailored best fit type. But those markers are important to nail down. And I think this is that difficult balance, which is that, an INJ can show up looking a lot of different ways, right? They're not going to just look one way. A person who has introverted intuition or perspectives as a dominant or driver function, they're not all going to be, like futurists or linguists, or, there's this handful of concepts or ideas we get for people who have this as a dominant function. And they're not all going to be people who are obsessed with looking down the line, right? There are people who have this as a dominant or driver function that might not be in a great place in their life, and they're not trying to think about the future at all. And they're not going to show up as somebody who's sitting there twirling their mustache and steepling their fingers, trying to figure out how to take over the world in this long-term way, or how to infest social ecosystems with their personal ideas. Like, Like they might just be living their life and, going to their bank job. Like that might just be what they're doing, but they're super into things that are introverted, intuition oriented, right? And that's really what it comes down to, is not getting too tied into or wrapped up into what it's supposed to look like in the outside world in this very small set number of ways it can show up. And at the same time, recognizing that you must be showing markers of this type in other ways that aren't necessarily your job, your career, how outgoing or reserved you are, how touchy-feely or cold you are. Like those are traits that change over time. But the one thing that doesn't change is that you get chemically rewarded for using certain functions. And that's really what it comes down to, is that type at the end of the day is that there are 8 different functions, or at least type as it's presented in the Myers-Briggs system, is that there's 8 different cognitive functions. And your brain chemically rewards you whenever you use your dominant or driver cognitive function. And that cocktail of chemicals that gets dumped into your brain every time you use that function is something that is going to constantly and perpetually encourage you to seek things that are orientated to that slice of life, right? Like those things that are attractive to that specific function. Now, lots of things are attractive to that specific function, whatever it is, right? Whatever of those 8 cognitive functions it is, there's a lot of stuff that's attractive to it. But it's not the limited set number of things it's attracted to. It's that you cannot stop being attracted to them. Right? And so you have to have this balance of going, type can look a lot of different ways, but the one thing it can't look is that you do not pursue those things. Like if you're not pursuing things that are attractive to that function, you are probably not using that function as a dominant.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. One of the ways that we've been talking about this lately, Antonia, is that it's almost like reality, the reality we swim in or move in, is divided into these 8 slices of reality, these 8 slices of energy, if you will. Almost imagine like there's an old school radio tower, broadcast radio tower, sending 8 different signals out from this tower of reality. And all of us are wired to pick up on some of these radio signals, metaphorically speaking. And when we pick up on these radio signals, we get rewarded for that mentally, cognitively. We feel like we overvalue that radio signal. We're like, this is the one that really matters because it really makes sense to us. We can hear that signal clearly. Our personal mental radio tunes that signal, and we're like, can't everybody hear this signal? It's so clear to me. I can hear it right here. Look, this is how reality works. But there are 7 other slices of reality that other people might be attuned to that I might not be attuned to. And I think if we look at the cognitive functions, 8 cognitive functions as slices of life, of energy of life, all of us have a relationship, well, to all of them, but we have more of a relationship to some than others. And I think that's really what defines personality type as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I think I was pretty confusing with the statement I made before you gave that really great metaphor. I'm like reviewing in my mind. I'm like, the only thing it isn't is that you're not paying attention to this thing. So I'm glad that you put it in the positive, which is, yeah, there are, and this is how I'm really starting to see type, by the way.
Yeah, me too.
Like almost on like a nucleus level, that there really are 8 slices of life, and I can't see beyond them as illustrated by these 8 functions. And it's like, well, okay, so let me give you a quick recap. So there's living in the moment, there's being here and now, and the experiences we have in the moment. That's extroverted sensing. And then there's
sensation,
right? And then there's like the catalog of those experiences over time that we can review and use to infuse into our now and into the future. Like we have all of this available to us, and then we have the catalog of everybody else's experiences. And we can take those to make better decisions and to understand who we are and recognize who we are based on all those experiences. Well, that would be introverted sensing or memory. So those are two, those are two very interesting relationships to time and two very interesting slices of life. And then there's the future, right? There's our relationship to the future and the meaning making and the stories and the narratives of our lives and our imagination about what this all means. And that would be introverted intuition or perspectives. And then there are opportunities and the opportunity we have to disrupt all of this and to see something new and to ask, where would we go if we didn't have to start from here? Grabbing different ideas and putting them together and understanding different connections. Well, that would be extroverted intuition or exploration. And I can't really see outside of those four perceiving functions as a way to kind of just ruminate in what's going on and why it's happening and when is it happening and what should I be focused on. And then there's the relationships that we have with each other and the vibe between people and understanding how our energies impact each other, and they impact each other in simple all the way up to beyond comprehension, complicated ways, and how we want to keep everybody at a relatively good space so that we don't kill each other and we can all work together and get things accomplished. That would be extroverted feeling or harmony. But then there's that sort of, that same relationship we have with ourselves internally, right? The relationship with all those voices inside and who we are and how things impact us on an emotional level and how we create convictions and ethics and understand our intentions and motivations. That would be introverted feeling or authenticity. And then there's the impact we have in the outside world. There's how we get things done and make projects happen and build and ameliorate and leave our thumbprint on the world and say, I was here, right? I made this, I built this, and I improved upon it. That would be extroverted thinking or effectiveness. And then there's our ideas and our beliefs and what makes sense to us and why do we think what we're thinking and what's logical and how do we explain things. That would be introverted thinking or accuracy. I look at these 8 different, like you mentioned, energies of life, and I have a hard time seeing what's outside of that in not just in this model, but in general. Like what lives outside of our relationships to others and self, and what lives outside of our thoughts, and then how we want to bring those to the outside world to make things, and what lives outside of our present, our past, our future, and then the just the sheer possibility of what could be outside of all of those time orientations. And that feels like those 8 energies really feel like an encapsulation of how we live our lives. And type is, or our personality types are, of those 8 slices of life, which one are we chemically rewarded for paying attention to, for really honing in on, and really feeling like this is our lane, this is our sandbox? For me, every time I think in terms of extroverted intuition or exploration, I get chemically rewarded. So I want more of that. It's almost like a drug, right? I want more and more and more of that. But I'm also rewarded when I hone my introverted thinking or my accuracy. When I do that, I feel like I'm me. I feel like I'm in my best self. And then, of course, I incorporate the other side of those polarities, the harmony and the memory part, or extroverted feeling and introverted sensing. I bring those up into it, and now I have a complete system running.
And so we each have this wiring where we're going to pay attention to these different energies, these signals of life. As you're listening along and you start to think about your own personality and your driver cognitive function and your co-pilot, your driver or your dominant, your co-pilot, your auxiliary, these are 2 energies that you are wired to be chemically rewarded for paying attention to and being in the midst of. And you're going to overvalue it. We all do. I overvalue the ones I'm attuned to. And it doesn't mean we don't want to grow or tap into the others. We don't want to just get one-sided. There's this idea of getting one-sided where we just focus on the 1 or 2 energies that our personality attunes us to. Clearly, we want to stretch and access all the areas of life represented. And there is something to be said for focusing on the things that our personality is attuned to. There's a sense that, well, who else is going to be proficient enough to pay attention to that? They're not wired this way. It's probably my job to pick up the mantle and represent this part of reality for all of us. I'm going to do my job and represent extroverted intuition, exploration as an ENFP, as my dominant driver function. And I'm going to do my job and represent introverted feeling or authenticity as an ENFP, as my co-pilot or auxiliary. I almost see that as like my job in life. for whatever that means for me specifically, whatever I apply it to. But who else is going to pay attention to those energies except for me and other ENFPs that are wired like me?
Yeah, I've started to think of it as stewardship and type as being a stewardship responsibility. Like you mentioned, there are these energies. I'm attuned to some of these energies. Of these 8 energies, I'm particularly attuned to 2 of them. I am attuned to one of them. And because of that, because I'm so focused on this aspect of life, and I can't not be focused on this aspect of life, I'm chemically rewarded for it, and it's a life finds a way situation. If the world was trying to pressure me out of it, if the world was trying to do everything it could to keep me from being an extroverted intuition or exploration, I would be a weed that found a crack through the concrete, right, in a concrete jungle. I would not be able to not use it. And I've seen people who are kept from using their dominant function. They are in a terrible state of depression because we know that this is almost like our purpose, right? We are meant to steward these aspects of life. And so type is flexible because it can show up in a lot of different ways. And it's also limited in the sense that we are stewards of these elements of our type. And that's really what it comes down to. It's a sense of responsibility we have to it. So as a person's looking for their best fit type, one question they could ask themselves is, of these 8 different elements of life, which one do I feel called to steward? Which one do I feel called to be a representative of? And that's not an easy thing. You know, a lot of people will identify with, say, the INFJ personality type. In fact, there's a lot of mistyped, quote unquote, INFJs. You're allowed to be that. And maybe you and I, Joel, have been a part of this challenge because when we talk about INFJs, we talk about them as being hypersensitive. But there's a lot of things in life that can create hypersensitivity. If you were raised in a dysfunctional or abusive household, man alive, you will develop a sense of empathy. You will develop a sense of hypersensitivity to other people's emotions because that was a survival tactic. So do INFJs develop hypersensitivity because it's a survival tactic? No, they come out of the hatch with it. Even if they're in the most loving, beautiful, Anna Karenina, all happy families are the same style of family, they're still going to have this because it's not a survival tactic. It's a way of being wired and a stewardship. It's a stewardship over this understanding. And so if a person is like, well, no, I was in this abusive household, and every time this parent came in, mom, dad was like super, I don't know, they were an addict, and they were like really angry every time they were either addicted or trying to be sober or whatever. And so I just really had to pick up this skill. And then we start talking about these INFJ traits. They're going to be like, oh, I must be an INFJ because I picked up those traits. But the traits are not the important thing. It's the stewardship that's the important thing. And INFJ is not going to be able to not be that person, right? I keep doing that, these double negatives. That make it hard to understand. But there's an intrinsicness to that style of wiring. Whereas life, nurture, not nature, but nurture can give us some of these traits because we had to have them, or because they were massively reinforced, or because the outside world rewarded it, and we wanted to get approval, not because our brains dumped a chemical cocktail in our mind every time we thought of that slice of life. So that's the challenge, right? The challenge is type can show up in a lot of different ways, but it also is going to show up in a limited set number of ways. And that limited set number of ways, there's more variety than we give it credit for, but there's not infinite variety. And I think that for me, really understanding the stewardship component, really understanding that I have a responsibility to my functions, I have a responsibility to be an ambassador of these functions, helps me determine the difference between what I built as a survival technique and in a defensive position against the world versus what is my purpose? Why am I here? What part of the social ecosystem do I fill? If everybody was against this thing, what would it be my responsibility to to defend it and to be an advocate for it. And when I pare it down to that, it becomes very clear to me what my type preferences are.
Well, and how I hear that in my mind is we're talking about type and our personalities no longer in just a descriptive framework, but a prescriptive framework. Like, here's what you can do with the life you've been given and the type that you've developed into and who you are as a person. Like, this is what's possible. This is the energies you could attune to. And if you could ergonomically design your life to augment, support, nurture, give opportunity to those energies that you carry inside of yourself and who you are as an essence, man, that's like a really exciting life. Think about that. Think about if your life could be about the things that you're wired to attend to, and also grow and stretch in the other areas too, not getting one-sided, right? Just always keep that in mind. We're not suggesting everybody walks around one-sided, only focusing on these specialties of life they're attuned to. Clearly, we have to round ourselves out as people. That's not what we're suggesting. But just think about the excitement that is, the opportunity that is for you, the prescriptive nature of your personality, not just the descriptive nature of it.
Yeah, well, what's nice is that if you actually are showing up in a way where you're an ambassador for your type and doing it well, you can't be one-sided. Like, as ENPs, you and I fully know that if we want to continue doing our extroverted intuition or exploration lifestyle, we have to get a really well-formed amount of introverted sensing or memory integrated into our lifestyles. Otherwise, we burn ourselves out.
So yesterday we planted flowers and took care of our physical yard, and we're so proud of ourselves. Look at all this yard work we did. It made everything look nice.
It's not just yard work. We did it in April.
That's right.
I'm not supposed to date this podcast, but we did it early enough so that we're going to be able to see the return later.
Yeah.
We did it in the right time, the right season, the right moment on the timeline.
We're so proud.
I'm so proud of myself. So it's those kinds of things when we really infuse in routine and ritual and rootedness and a sense of establishment, then that facilitates our ability to be ENPs so much better. So actually doing what we're talking about, you get to a law of diminishing returns if you are one-sided. You have to integrate the other side. Otherwise, you hit a glass ceiling.
Well, it's because if you look at the car model, driver, co-pilot, 10-year-old, 3-year-old, we're also stewards of the energies of our 10-year-old and 3-year-old process. It's just that we have a lot of uncertainty on what that means for us. In a sense, I feel a responsibility to capture the past. I have an introverted sensing memory, 3-year-old. It's my inferior process. I have this compulsion to take pictures of everything, record things, write things down. And I keep in my mind, it's this unconscious trigger, somebody's going to need this some point in the future. Some historian's going to want this information. It's my responsibility to make sure I preserve as much as I possibly can for future generations. To the point where I sometimes stress myself out around it. I'm why am I preserving so much? What's going on here? It's because I feel the responsibility of that slice of energy of life, but I have so much uncertainty of what to actually do with that responsibility I feel from it.
Well, and which thing needs to be preserved.
Exactly.
Just exactly how many of Piper's I love you notes needs to have a picture taken of it.
I know. I've got a ton on my phone. I don't know why.
Joel's answer is all of them. Every single one that's made. Whereas I'm on the opposite side. I feel uncertainty, so I don't take pictures of any of it.
Yeah.
So it's like an all or nothing. It's a toggle switch. But I agree with you. That said, I'm certainly not going to feel like it's my job to make sure that introverted sensing or memory is represented in the ecosystem of the world, right?
Yeah.
It's not my job to preserve the past when it comes to all the social elements of it or all the life that we did leave. It's my job to steward disruption and possibilities and what ifs. So we're playing around with this thought, but what came up for us as we were doing all of these interviews were that some people of these types showed up a little different than the stereotypes. They showed up different than the expectation. And that, I think, was a really nice component of it. It was really nice to see the variety of how these types can show up. And that said, because all of these people were on a growth path, you could tell that they had this sense of stewardship. They had this sense of they were going to be the best version of themselves, and they wanted to represent their type well. And this is part of the gift that they're given to the world. And that really became very clear to me as we were going through these interviews. So I would say that was probably one of the biggest takeaways that I had, was this concept of stewardship, this concept of just how type works, right? It's not that I'm going to show up as every other ENTP. I'm going to show up as my own version of ENTP, but I'm still going to feel a sense of responsibility to these cognitive functions that have given me so much, and that I have the opportunity to represent them well. I have the opportunity to be a really great part of the ecosystem if I honor those functions, become the best version of those functions, and then give it back using those functions.
Yeah. I'll just throw in some fun comments about the interview series as well, because this is probably the only time I'll have a chance to say them.
Yeah.
It was really interesting in the midst of interviewing. So we're interviewing most people remotely. We had a few people actually come to the studio because of world events and circumstances at the time of recording, and just distance, because we had people from all over the world, coming on in different places in the world. But it was really indicative of each type on how they approach the interview itself, right? Some people preparing for it, having lots of preparation. Some people kind of coming and winging it. It was interesting. Anytime we had somebody we're talking to using extroverted feeling or harmony, it was very challenging at moments for them to be in an easy flow with us, because we had shut all the cameras off, like online. We were just doing the audio. And so they couldn't see our faces. They couldn't engage with us in like a full fidelity of what was happening on our side. And so it was interesting just to see how during this, technically, we like turned cameras on for extroverted feeling users, and we would work with the types to help them present the best interview possible. And I thought that was a very interesting experience from a production side of things in the interview process.
Well, and how people responded to certain questions.
Yeah.
Like some questions for certain types, you couldn't shut them up, right? They just had so much to say. And other types, it was like kind of pulling, because we went through a very similar series of questions. And I mean, that just goes back to profiler training and how we use the exact same process in a profiling session. You ask a question, and if a person doesn't really have much content around there or around that question, that is in and of itself a huge clue about what's going on for them. Whereas if you ask a question or ask about an aspect of, just common life, and they light up and they get excited and they say a whole bunch of stuff, well, that's a huge clue too. And these interviews really bore out. It doesn't only work in an interview for profiling, it works in general. When you ask a certain kind of question and the person's like, I don't know what to say. You go, okay, moving on. And I think that really bore out in just a normal, chit-chat style.
Yeah. And then finally, I'll just say that a lot of the great conversations that were stimulated underneath the podcast themselves in the comment area, a lot of people expanded on some of the ideas. People identified with their type. They had questions, and some of the people that were interviewed, the interviewees, some of our subjects that we interviewed, were able to come on and converse with people, have like actual conversation with them in those comments.
Oh man! First of all, the interview we got the most comments for was the ISTP interview.
So far, at the time of this recording.
At the time of this recording, so far. And in my profiling, I've also been profiling people recently that have ISTP preferences more than ever before.
In our coaching also.
And also in our coaching. I'm realizing just how many, I think this is something that's becoming very clear to myself and then other people who are in our profiling ecosystem, like our consultants and the people who help us train in profiler training. It is becoming very clear to me how many mistyped sensors are in the community. And I don't mean like, people talk about this in a derogatory way where there'll be mistyped INFJs or mistyped INTJs, and they'll say, oh, those are just ISFPs, or those are just ISTPs, or there's just sensors. But there's really not, and we're guilty of this too. There's really not that many high quality resources for sensors. And the reason why we're guilty of it is that in the early days of Personality Hacker, one of our missions was to provide material and resources for intuitives to encourage them to play a bigger game, to go really become the best version of themselves. Because our philosophy was that the world provides sensors with plenty of material and resources, and it's the intuitives that are ignored. But I've since changed my trajectory a bit on that. I've realized that, well, we're not in the world in general. We're not doing general advice. we're talking about type. We're giving type resources. And the further down the timeline we go, the more I'm realizing that resources for sensors are crucial, not just because they're actually the underserved demographic in this industry, right? In this industry, intuitives are the well-resourced demographic, and sensors are the ones that don't have good resources. So it's not just that in this community, in this particular industry, they're underserved, but because they're underserved, why on earth would they identify with personality types that are not that flushed out? So of course they're going to misidentify as intuitives because there's so much more content and resource around that. And so we have readjusted our thinking. And we're, I think, more committed to making sure that we have resources for sensor types that are just as fleshed out, just as nuanced, just as textured as the resources for intuitives, so they can find their best fit type and rest into it and become the best version of themselves without having to look for sort of something that is an approximation of how they feel with the resources available.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, we don't give a crap what type you are. Do you want to grow? Do you want to develop yourself? Do you want to become the best version like we're attuned to in our lives? Let's do that together. Let's co-create that together. Who cares what personality type are? Whether you're sensor, intuitive, I don't care. Let's do this together. Let's find these growth paths and avenues for growth in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly in descriptions of things like extroverted sensing and introverted sensing, they're so much more fleshed out. There's so much more texture there than I think the type community, even in the old guard from like 30, 40 years ago, I think that we've all done a disservice to these sensory functions. And so we want to provide those resources so that, like you said, Joel, people can become the best version of their type, regardless of what that type is. We don't really care what it is. Show up, be that steward, that ambassador of the slice of life that your brain has predetermined to give you a nice little chemical reward for thinking about, and be a really good ambassador for that.
And talking about you and your type and your chemical rewards, how about you tell us what you're thinking about all the stuff we just talked about? Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your personal story. Where has some of these concepts shown up in your life? Are you resonating with this idea of being a steward over a slice of energy of life or a few energies of life? Does that excite you? Does that intimidate you? Does that make you feel, oh man, I feel all that weight of responsibility? Can I just live my life, Joel and Antonia? Do I have to rise to this greater call of something bigger? I just want to have some ice cream and chill out. Can't I just do that in a cup of coffee?
Yes, the answer is yes. Of course you can.
Of course you can, but we do want to hear what you're thinking about some of the concepts we presented to you today. And have you had a chance to go back through and listen to some of these interviews? And what was some of your takeaways from them? One of the biggest surprises I had was the low amount of comments under the INFJ podcast. I expected that. I saved it for last on purpose because I thought it would build over time. And by the time we released it at the very end, it would be, because, INFJs are typically a large part of our audience, it would be like this floodgates of comments, and I was very surprised. It really broke a lot of my assumptions, and I think it really speaks to there's so many resources, like you were talking about, Tony, for intuitives, especially INJs online, that some of the other types, like ISTPs, got a lot of comments. So come over, let us know what's going on for you. We want to hear from you. Your voice matters to us.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. It helps us out spiritually and psychologically because I read them and I'm very happy when I read them. So if you want to give me a gift, you can leave a rating and review on iTunes. It's a very pleasant thing to run into and read with a cup of coffee in the morning. We also have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. If you leave a rating and review for us on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot.
And don't forget, we have an entire program catalog, a suite of programs and products that we've developed to help you in a personal growth journey through the lens of your unique personality type. So we take typology, we take this system, and we develop programs that will help you grow in different slices of your life, whether it's your relationship with our couples mapping program, business with our Hardwired for Wealth program, or career, or just general personal growth. We have all sorts of programs that we think is a great fit for you on your growth journey. So come over to personalityhacker.com and see which program is the right one for you. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.